My daughter told me I was too old to understand modern parenting, then asked me to babysit her kids for free while she went on a 2-week cruise with my money. The words hang in the silence of my empty Chicago apartment like smoke from a fire that's been burning for years. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this story sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me continue sharing these painful truths. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a studio apartment on the north side of Chicago, where the L train rattles my windows every 20 minutes, and the radiator clanks like an old ghost trying to get my attention. The apartment smells faintly of lavender air freshener and the lingering scent of instant coffee, the only luxury I allow myself these days. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 years, I sat at my small kitchen table with its chipped Formica surface, wearing my faded blue robe that's seen better decades. My fingers, gnarled with arthritis but still steady enough to dial a phone, traced the rim of my coffee mug. A Mother's Day gift from 2018 that reads, "World's Best Mom" in cheerful yellow letters that have started to fade. I was staring at my phone screen, reading the same text message I'd received the night before. "Mom, can you watch Emma and Jake this weekend?" Emergency came up. You know how kids are with strangers. XOXO, Sarah. An emergency. That's what my daughter calls her weekend getaways now. Last month's emergency was a spa retreat in Wisconsin. The month before, it was a work conference that her Instagram photos revealed to be a wine tasting tour in Napa Valley. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah, my only child, the little girl I'd raised alone after her father walked out when she was 8, was now treating me like the stranger. I, who had worked 2 jobs to keep food on our table and clothes on her back, who had attended every school play and soccer game even when my feet ached from standing behind a department store counter for 10 hours straight. I looked around my apartment, all 400 square feet of it, and tried to remember when I'd last had a visitor who wasn't asking for something. The walls were covered with photographs spanning 5 decades. Sarah's school pictures arranged chronologically, showing her transformation from a gap-toothed first grader to a confident MBA graduate. Wedding photos from her marriage to David, where she'd insisted I wear beige so I wouldn't clash with the wedding party's color scheme. Pictures of my grandchildren, Emma, now 12, and Jake, 8, whom I barely see except when I'm needed as free childcare. The largest frame held a picture of Sarah and me from her college graduation. We're both smiling, my arm wrapped around her shoulders, her hand resting on mine. I remember that day clearly, the pride swelling in my chest as she walked across that stage, the satisfaction of knowing that every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd saved instead of spending on myself, had been worth it. That was before she became successful, before her marketing career took off and she bought the house in Wilmette with the 4 bedrooms and the 3-car garage, before she started using phrases like generational wealth and financial boundaries whenever I mentioned needing help with my prescription costs. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah. "Also, can you pick up groceries for the weekend? Emma's going through a picky phase and Jake needs those organic snacks. I'll Venmo you back. Eventually. LOL. Eventually. The word that had become the soundtrack of my relationship with my daughter. She'd pay me back eventually. She'd visit more often eventually. She'd introduce me to her new friends eventually. Eventually had become never, and never had become normal. I set down my coffee mug with more force than I intended, the sound echoing in my small space. The woman in the mirror across the room. When had she become so thin, so gray, so invisible? Stared back at me with eyes that had seen too much disappointment. This was my life now. Margaret Chen, retired after 45 years of customer service jobs, living on Social Security that barely covered rent and utilities, while my successful daughter lived 20 minutes away in comfort I'd never known. The same daughter who called me too old to understand modern anything, yet young enough to provide free childcare, grocery shopping, and the occasional loan that became a gift through strategic forgetfulness. I opened my laptop, a refurbished model I'd bought 3 years ago with birthday money Sarah had given me, back when she still bothered with birthdays, and logged into my bank account. The checking account showed $247.83. The savings account, the one I'd been building since Sarah was born, the one that was supposed to be my safety net, showed 1,134.15s. I'd been dipping into it more often lately. $20 here for groceries when Sarah was between paychecks, $50 there for Emma's school supplies when the school district had unexpected fees, $120 last month for Jake's birthday party because Sarah had overestimated the budget. The birthday party. I'd arrived at their house carrying a grocery bag full of party supplies I'd bought with my savings, watching Sarah effortlessly play the role of the perfect mother while I arranged paper plates and inflated balloons. Her friends had complimented her on the beautiful party, never knowing that my fixed income had funded their children's entertainment. "Mom, you're so good at this party stuff," Sarah had said, patting my shoulder with the patronizing affection reserved for elderly relatives who are useful for their domestic skills, but not much else. "It's like you have a natural gift for, the little things." The little things. My contributions had been reduced to little things. My phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. Sarah's name flashed on the screen, along with the photo I'd assigned to her contact. A smiling headshot from her company website, all professional polish and confident success. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was rushed, distracted. I could hear traffic in the background and the click of her turn signal. "Did you get my text about this weekend?" "Yes, I got it." "Great. So you can watch them?" "I know it's short notice, but you know how unpredictable work can be. This client meeting just came up and David has that golf tournament." "Sarah," I interrupted, something in my voice making her pause. "What kind of emergency is it this time?" A silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of her car and the distant honking of Chicago traffic. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to the carefully modulated patience she used with difficult clients. "Mom, I don't know what you mean by this time. This is work-related. Important work-related. The kind of thing that pays for Emma's violin lessons and Jake's soccer league. The grandparent stuff you're always asking about. The grandparent stuff. As if my desire to be involved in my grandchildren's lives was a commodity she could dole out in exchange for services rendered. I closed my eyes and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart, because that had been breaking slowly for years, but something deeper. Some fundamental belief I'd held about what it meant to be a mother, about the reciprocal nature of love, about the assumption that sacrifice would eventually be met with gratitude rather than entitlement. "I'll think about it," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. What? "Mom, I need an answer. I have to confirm the hotel reservation." Hotel reservation. For the emergency. The work emergency that required hotel accommodations. I said, "I'll think about it, Sarah." I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling slightly as I set the phone face down on the table. Outside my window, Chicago continued its relentless pace. Millions of people living their lives while I sat in my small apartment, finally beginning to understand that I had spent 3 years, maybe longer, slowly disappearing from my own life. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I didn't move to reheat it. Instead, I sat in the growing silence, listening to the radiator's familiar clank and the distant sound of the L train carrying people to places they needed to go, to people who were waiting for them, to lives that had room for them. For the first time in years, I wondered what it would feel like to matter again. The silence after hanging up on Sarah felt different than the usual quiet of my apartment. It had weight to it, like the moment before a storm breaks. I found myself walking to the small closet where I kept my important papers, pulling out a shoebox I hadn't opened in months. Inside were the receipts. Hundreds of them, dating back 3 years to when Sarah first started asking for little favors. I'd kept them all, initially thinking I was being responsible, tracking expenses that would eventually be repaid. Now they looked like evidence of my own foolishness. $67.43 for Emma's school supplies in September 2021. Just until my bonus comes through, Mom. $156.78 for Jake's winter coat that same year. Kids grow so fast, you know how it is. $234.12 for groceries when Sarah was between paychecks in December. Christmas groceries, I remembered now, for a Christmas dinner I wasn't even invited to stay for. Each receipt told a story. and together they painted a picture I'd been too afraid to see clearly. I was being systematically drained, $20 at a time, $50 here, $100 there. Death by 1,000 small cuts to my already thin budget. But the financial drain was only part of it. The real poison was in how Sarah had learned to ask. "Mom, you know how much I appreciate everything you do," she'd say, her voice taking on that particular tone, part gratitude, part manipulation. "I don't know what we'd do without you. You're such a lifesaver." The compliments always came before the requests, sugar before the medicine. And I, desperate for any acknowledgement that I still mattered, would feel my resolve melt every time. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our text history, months of messages that read like a manual for emotional manipulation. "You're the only person I trust with the kids, Mom. Daycare workers are just strangers. I know this is last minute, but you're so flexible. Not like David's uptight mother. The kids always have more fun with you anyway. You have that grandmother magic." Grandmother magic. As if my willingness to exhaust myself for free childcare was some mystical gift, rather than the desperation of a lonely woman who would take love in whatever form it was offered. My mind drifted back to the beginning, to when this pattern had started. It was right after Sarah's promotion 3 years ago, when she'd moved to the house in Wilmette. I'd been so proud, driving out to see their new home with its manicured lawn and attached garage. "Mom, look at this kitchen," Sarah had said, gesturing to granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that cost more than I made in 6 months. "We finally have space to entertain. You should come over more often." But the invitations never came. Instead, I became the person who was called when they needed something. A babysitter who worked for free. A personal shopper who used her own money. A cleaning lady who was paid in guilt and false gratitude. I remembered the first time Sarah had asked for money. She'd come to my old apartment, the larger one I could afford before rent increased, looking beautiful and put together in her designer clothes. "Mom, I'm embarrassed to ask this," she'd said, sitting on my second-hand sofa with perfect posture. "But we're having some cash flow issues with the new house, just temporary. Could you lend us $3,000? I'll pay you back with interest." $3,000, half of my savings at the time. But the way she'd said it, embarrassed, temporary, with interest, made it sound reasonable, responsible even, like I was making an investment in my daughter's success. I'd withdrawn the money the next day, handed it to her in an envelope like a grandmother slipping a birthday 20 to a grandchild. She'd hugged me tight, promising to pay it back within 3 months. That was 2.5 years ago. The subject of repayment had become a taboo topic, something that would make me seem petty and ungrandmotherly to bring up. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the slow erosion of my dignity, the way Sarah had learned to manage me like a difficult employee who needed careful handling to remain productive. "Mom, you know how grateful I am," became her standard preface to any request. As if gratitude was a currency that could be spent indefinitely without ever needing to be replenished with actual action. I thought about last Thanksgiving, when I'd spent $78 on ingredients to make pies for their dinner party. I'd arrived at their house at 8 in the morning, spent 6 hours cooking in their kitchen while Sarah got ready and David watched football. When the guests arrived, Sarah's colleagues and neighbors, people I'd never met despite living 20 minutes away, I was introduced as David's helper and asked to serve dessert from the kitchen. David's helper, not Sarah's mother, not the grandmother of their children, not even Margaret, just the help. I'd stood in their gleaming kitchen, wearing my best dress that suddenly felt shabby among their designer casual wear, serving my own pies to strangers who thanked David for the amazing dessert while I cleaned up in silence. That was when it hit me. I had become invisible in my own daughter's life. Present only when needed, acknowledged only when useful, appreciated only in the abstract. The phone rang again, startling me back to the present. Sarah's name on the screen, probably calling to clarify my confusing response about thinking about it. I let it ring. It rang again 5 minutes later, then again, then a text. "Mom, call me back. We need to talk about this weekend. We need to talk." Not, "I'd like to discuss this," or, "Could we figure this out together?" The language of management, of someone accustomed to getting their way through persistence and pressure. I thought about Emma and Jake, my grandchildren who barely knew me despite all the hours I'd spent caring for them. Emma, who was polite but distant, already learning at 12 that Grandma Margaret was the woman who showed up when Mom and Dad needed help. Jake, who was warmer but still saw me as the babysitter who brought snacks and watched cartoons, not as someone with stories to tell or wisdom to share. They loved me the way children love reliable service providers, with the casual affection reserved for people who exist to meet their needs. And whose fault was that? I'd allowed myself to become a function rather than a person, a role rather than a relationship. The receipts were still scattered across my kitchen table, months of evidence that I'd been funding my own irrelevance. But looking at them now, I felt something I hadn't expected. Anger. Not the sharp, hot anger of a moment's frustration, but the deep, cold anger of someone who had finally seen the pattern clearly. The slow-burning rage of a woman who had spent 3 years believing that love required her to disappear, that being a good mother meant accepting crumbs of affection in exchange for substantial sacrifice. I picked up one receipt at random, $89.34 for groceries in March. I remembered that day. Sarah had called while I was at the store, asking me to grab a few things for their dinner party that weekend. A dinner party I hadn't been invited to, for friends I'd never met, to celebrate a promotion she'd mentioned to me in passing. I'd pushed my cart through the aisles of the expensive grocery store near their house, buying imported cheese and organic vegetables I'd never tasted, wine that cost more than my weekly food budget, feeling proud that I could contribute to my daughter's success. Now, looking at that receipt, I saw it differently. I saw a woman who had been trained to pay for the privilege of being useful, to fund her own marginalization, to subsidize a relationship where she gave everything and received nothing but the opportunity to give more. My phone buzzed with another text. "Mom, I'm worried about you. You're acting strange. Is everything okay? Should I come over?" Should I come over? The first time in months, Sarah had suggested visiting me, and it was because I wasn't behaving according to her expectations. Not because she missed me or wanted to spend time with me, but because her reliable resource was malfunctioning and needed to be fixed. I looked around my small apartment, seeing it suddenly through different eyes. This wasn't the home of a woman who was cherished by her family. This was the home of someone who had been systematically isolated and exploited, someone who had confused being needed with being loved. The coffee mug with its fading "World's Best Mom" inscription sat on the table next to the receipts. A cruel joke now, that mug. The world's best mom, apparently, was someone who paid her own daughter for the privilege of being ignored. I picked up the mug and walked to the sink, pouring out the cold coffee. As I watched it spiral down the drain, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was done being the world's best mom, if that's what it meant. It was time to find out who I might be if I stopped trying to buy love that was never for sale. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 12 text messages. Sarah's panic had escalated overnight, morphing from annoyance into full-scale manipulation mode. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Are you having memory issues? Should I call Dr. Peterson?" Memory issues. The go-to explanation whenever an elderly person stops complying with unreasonable demands. I wasn't forgetting anything. I was finally remembering everything. I made my coffee and sat down to read through her messages chronologically, watching her tactics evolve from confusion to concern, to barely concealed threats. "Mom, I'm really worried. This isn't like you. David thinks maybe you're going through something. Depression affects seniors differently. I've already told the Johnsons you'd watch their kids too this weekend. They're counting on you now. And finally, Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about your capabilities. Maybe it's time to look into some kind of assisted living situation where you'd have more support." Assisted living. The nuclear option. The threat that every aging parent fears. Being declared incompetent because they've stopped being convenient. I set down my phone and looked out my window at the street below. Rodriguez from the apartment across the hall was walking her ancient terrier, the same routine they'd maintained for the 5 years I'd lived here. She was at least 80, living independently, managing her own life with dignity. Yet I was being threatened with institutionalization because I'd said "I'll think about it" to a babysitting request. My phone rang. Sarah again. Mom, thank God. I've been so worried. Are you feeling all right? Her voice was different now, artificially sweet. The tone she used with difficult clients who needed to be carefully managed back into compliance. I'm fine, Sarah. Good, good. Because I was starting to think, well, never mind. So about this weekend? I said I'd think about it. A pause. Then the sweetness cracked slightly. Mom, I don't understand what there is to think about. You love spending time with Emma and Jake. They're asking for Grandma Margaret specifically. Asking for me specifically? I almost laughed. Emma barely looked up from her phone when I was there, and Jake saw me as the woman who provided snacks and put on cartoons. But Sarah had learned that invoking the children's supposed desires was usually enough to break down my resistance. When did they ask for me specifically? Another pause. Longer this time. Well, they always enjoy when you're here. Emma said just last week how much she likes your soup. My soup? The canned tomato soup I heated up because it was cheap and they would eat it. Not exactly a culinary request, but Sarah was grasping at straws. I'll let you know by tonight, I said. Mom? I hung up. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Sarah standing in the hallway, perfectly dressed even at 9 in the morning, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers and wearing the expression she used for damage control. I opened the door. Surprise, she said, holding up the flowers with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I thought I'd bring you a little pick-me-up and we could have coffee together. Like old times. Old times. As if we'd ever had a tradition of spontaneous coffee visits. Sarah hadn't been to my apartment in over a year, and that visit had been to ask if she could store some of their seasonal decorations in my closet because their house didn't have enough storage space. She walked in without being invited, her eyes scanning my small space with the barely concealed disapproval she'd learned to hide but never quite eliminated. I saw her notice the chipped paint by the window, the outdated appliances, the furniture that had been secondhand when I bought it. Mom, you should really consider getting some new curtains, she said, settling onto my couch like she was doing me a favor by visiting. These look so dated. Dated. Like everything else about me, apparently. She placed the flowers on my coffee table, where they looked out of place and temporary. I got you those daisies you like. I hated daisies, had always hated them. Sarah knew I preferred roses, but roses cost more than the $5 bouquet she'd grabbed from the store display. Thank you, I said, because old habits die hard. So, she settled back with the confident air of someone who'd come to solve a problem. I think I know what's going on here. You're feeling left out, aren't you? Unappreciated? The accuracy of her assessment was almost insulting. She'd identified my emotional state with the clinical precision of someone conducting market research, reducing my pain to a simple case study that could be managed with the right approach. I want you to know how much we value everything you do, she continued, reaching over to pat my hand. Emma and Jake are so lucky to have a grandmother who cares so much. And David and I, we don't know what we'd do without you. The script was perfect. Acknowledgement of my feelings, followed by reassurance about my value, delivered with just enough physical affection to seem genuine. She'd probably used similar techniques in boardroom negotiations. But Mom? Her voice took on a gentle, concerned tone. This weekend is really important. It's not just about watching the kids. It's about family. About being there for each other when it matters. Being there for each other. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned everything valuable. When have you been there for me, Sarah? The question surprised both of us. I hadn't planned to ask it, but there it was, sitting between us like an unwelcome guest. Her composure flickered for just a moment. Mom, I'm here now, aren't I? I brought you flowers. I'm taking time out of my busy schedule. When I was in the hospital last year for my surgery, you visited once. For 20 minutes. Between Jake's soccer practice and your book club. I was there when it mattered. For the important stuff. When I couldn't afford my blood pressure medication last month, you told me to look into generic brands. That's just being practical. When was the last time you called me just to talk? Not to ask for something, not to arrange childcare, not to update me on your schedule, just to see how I was doing. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of the radiator and the distant traffic outside. Sarah's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the irritation creeping into her expression. "Mom, I don't think this is fair. I call you all the time, to ask for things, to include you in our lives, as unpaid help." She stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "You know what? I don't have time for this guilt trip. I have a business to run, children to raise, a marriage to maintain. I'm sorry if I don't have time to sit around chatting about our feelings like we're in some kind of therapy session." There it was. The real Sarah, stripped of her careful management techniques and artificial sweetness. The Sarah who saw my need for connection as a burden, my desire for a relationship as an unreasonable demand on her precious time. "I work 60 hours a week," she continued, pacing around my small living room like a caged animal. "I'm raising 2 kids, managing a household, trying to build a career. And yes, sometimes I need help. That's what families do. They help each other. Help goes both ways, Sarah. I've helped you plenty. Who do you think paid for your new glasses last year? You paid half, after I asked 3 times. And your prescription delivery service? I pay for that myself. You set it up, but I pay the bills." She stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something colder. Calculation. "Mom, are you keeping track? Are you actually keeping some kind of scorecard of every little thing?" Every little thing. My surgery, my medication, my basic needs for human connection, all reduced to little things that shouldn't warrant attention or reciprocation. That's when I made the mistake of looking at her purse. A designer bag I recognized from a magazine, the kind that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. On her wrist, a watch I'd never seen before, elegant and expensive. Her shoes, her clothes, everything about her radiated a prosperity that she'd somehow convinced me she couldn't afford to share. "Sarah, how much did that purse cost?" "What? Mom, that's not—" "How much?" She shifted uncomfortably. "It was a gift. From David. For my promotion. The promotion you got 6 months ago? The one that came with the raise you mentioned once?" Her face went pale. We both knew where this was going. "Mom, I don't see how—" "The raise you got 6 months ago, while you were asking me to pay for Emma's violin lessons because money was tight." The silence was deafening. She stood frozen in my living room, caught in a lie that was bigger than either of us had acknowledged until this moment. "Those lessons cost me $400, Sarah. Money I took from my savings because you said you couldn't afford them right now. We had unexpected expenses." "What expenses? The vacation to Florida last month? The new furniture I saw in your Instagram posts? The dinner parties you throw for your friends?" She sat down heavily, her perfect composure finally collapsing entirely. For the first time in years, my successful, confident daughter looked like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Mom, you don't understand. It's not about the money. It's about cash flow. We have expenses you wouldn't understand. I understand that you have a $3,000 handbag while your mother eats canned soup for dinner because she spent her grocery money on your children's activities." The words hung in the air between us like a judgment neither of us could take back. Sarah stared at me with wide eyes, as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "Was I just being used?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the silence of my small apartment like a prayer for honesty that I wasn't sure either of us was ready to answer. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out but the sound of someone who had finally run out of carefully crafted explanations for unconscionable behavior. And in that moment of silence, I got my answer. Sarah's silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the artificial sweetness, replaced by something sharp and defensive. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. That bag was a gift, and even if it wasn't, what I spend my money on is my business. I work hard for what I have." The deflection was immediate and practiced. Turn the focus from her exploitation back to her achievements. Make me feel guilty for questioning her success. But something had shifted in me during that moment of silence. I'd seen the truth in her eyes before she'd had time to construct her defense. "You're right," I said quietly. "What you spend your money on is your business. Just like what I spend my money on is mine." She blinked, confused by my calm tone. This wasn't the script she was used to. Usually by now I would be apologizing, backtracking, making her feel better about whatever revelation had made her uncomfortable. Of course, Mom. I never said, so I won't be paying for Emma's violin lessons anymore, or Jake's soccer fees, or your grocery runs. The color drained from her face. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm very serious. She stood up quickly, her designer heels clicking against my worn hardwood floor. Mom, those kids are your grandchildren. You can't punish them because you're upset with me. There it was. The manipulation technique I'd fallen for dozens of times before. Make it about the children. Make me the villain who was hurting innocent kids because of adult disagreements. But I could see the strategy now, clear as daylight. I'm not punishing anyone, Sarah. I'm just not subsidizing your family's lifestyle anymore. Subsidizing? Her voice pitched higher, the way it used to when she was a teenager caught in a lie. Mom, we never asked you to subsidize anything. You offered to help. Did I? Or did you carefully orchestrate situations where offering was the only way to maintain any connection with my grandchildren? She stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. In a way, I suppose I had. This was the first time in 3 years I'd spoken the language of boundaries instead of the language of endless accommodation. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from David, Sarah's husband. Hi, Margaret. Sarah's really upset. Not sure what's going on, but maybe we can all sit down and talk this through. The kids are asking about their weekend with Grandma. I showed Sarah the screen. You called David already? I was worried about you. You're acting so strange. Strange. There was that word again. Apparently, self-respect was strange behavior for someone in my position. What exactly did you tell him? She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around my apartment as if looking for an escape route. Just that you seemed confused, upset about things that happened years ago. Maybe having some clarity issues. Clarity issues. The clinical term for an elderly person who was becoming inconveniently self-aware. My phone rang. David's name on the screen. I answered, putting it on speaker before Sarah could object. Margaret? Hey, it's David. Sarah filled me in on what's happening. Are you feeling okay? David's voice was carefully modulated, the tone he probably used in business meetings when he needed to manage a difficult situation. He was a nice enough man, but weak. He'd learned early in his marriage that it was easier to go along with Sarah's version of events than to risk her displeasure. I'm feeling fine, David. Clearer than I've felt in years, actually. That's good. But Sarah mentioned you might not be able to watch the kids this weekend. The thing is, we've already made commitments based on my unpaid labor. A pause. Well, I wouldn't put it that way exactly. How would you put it? Another pause. Longer this time. In the background, I could hear Emma's voice asking something about her violin lesson. My heart clenched, but I forced myself to stay focused. Margaret, you know how much we appreciate everything you do. The kids love spending time with you. Emma was just saying yesterday how much she enjoys. David? Stop. My voice was steady, but firm. Emma barely acknowledges my presence when I'm there. Jake sees me as the snack lady, and that's not their fault. It's yours. You've taught them that I'm help, not family. That's not true. When was the last time you invited me to dinner? Not to cook, not to babysit, just to eat with your family? Silence on the other end of the line. Sarah was staring at me with something between shock and admiration, as if she was seeing a person she'd never met before. When was the last time you asked about my life, my health, my interests? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of a service provider? Margaret, I think you're being a little unfair. Am I? Tell me one thing about my life that doesn't relate to what I can do for your family. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I know you worked at Macy's for 30 years. 45 years? Various department stores? I retired 2 years ago. Right. And you live on the north side. Have for 5 years. You've never visited. Another pause. Margaret, I think we should all sit down and talk about this face to face. Maybe this weekend, after the kids get back from their sleepover at your place. There won't be a sleepover. The finality in my voice surprised even me. Sarah's eyes widened, and I heard David's sharp intake of breath through the phone. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice taking on a pleading quality I hadn't heard since she was a child. "Please don't do this. The kids will be so disappointed." "Will they? Or will you just tell them Grandma Margaret wasn't available, and they'll shrug and move on to whatever entertainment you've arranged to replace me?" She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. We both knew I was right. "David," I continued, "I'm not trying to hurt anyone, but I'm done being taken for granted. If you want me to have a relationship with Emma and Jake, it needs to be a real relationship, not just babysitting duty. Of course, we want that too. But this weekend, you'll need to make other arrangements." I hung up before he could respond. Sarah stood in the middle of my living room, looking lost. For the first time in years, her perfect composure was completely gone. Her hair was slightly mussed from running her hands through it. Her lipstick was wearing off, and there were actual tears in her eyes. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening. This isn't like you. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I've been so focused on being the person you needed me to be that I forgot who I actually am. You're my mother. You're Emma and Jake's grandmother. That's who you are. Is it? Or am I Margaret Chen, a woman who worked for 45 years, who raised a daughter alone, who has her own thoughts and feelings and needs that matter?" She looked at me like I was speaking in riddles. To her, I suppose I was. In her world, I existed to serve a function. The idea that I might have an identity beyond that function was genuinely confusing to her. My phone buzzed again. Emma this time, texting from Sarah's phone. "Grandma Margaret, Mom says you might not watch us this weekend. Are you sick?" The message hit me like a physical blow. Sweet Emma, who barely looked up from her devices when I was around, was now reaching out because her routine was being disrupted. Not because she missed me, but because she was concerned about the reliability of her childcare arrangement. I showed the message to Sarah. "Did you tell her to send this?" "No. She wanted to text you herself when she heard we might need to cancel." But I could see the calculation in Sarah's eyes. She knew that message from Emma would be harder for me to resist than any argument she could make herself. I typed back, "I'm not sick, sweetheart. Just need to take care of some things. Maybe we can spend time together soon when it's just about us wanting to see each other." Sarah read over my shoulder, her frown deepening. "What does that mean? When it's just about us wanting to see each other?" "It means I want to have a relationship with my grandchildren that isn't based on your convenience." "Mom, that's not fair. They love you." "Do they? Or do they love what I provide? The snacks, the cartoons, the lack of rules? When was the last time Emma asked me about my life? When has Jake ever shown interest in anything about me that wasn't directly related to entertainment or food?" Sarah sank back onto my couch, her head in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were red. "I don't know how to fix this," she said quietly. "I don't even know what you want from me." It was the first honest thing she'd said all morning. The first admission that there was something that needed fixing, something that had gone wrong between us. "I want to matter," I said simply. "Not as a resource to be managed, but as a person. I want my daughter to call me because she misses talking to me, not because she needs something. I want my grandchildren to know who I am, not just what I can do for them. But you do matter. You matter so much. Sarah, if I died tomorrow, how long would it take you to find a replacement babysitter? A week? 2 weeks?" She stared at me, unable to answer. "That's how much I matter. I'm replaceable help that happens to share your DNA." My phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. "Hello? Mrs. Chen? This is Nancy Williams, Emma's violin teacher. I just wanted to follow up about next month's payment. I know you mentioned you handle Emma's lesson fees, and I wanted to make sure we had the schedule sorted out." I looked at Sarah, who was watching me with wide eyes. Even Emma's violin teacher knew that Grandma Margaret was the one who paid for lessons. "Ms. Williams, there's been a change. You'll need to contact Emma's parents directly for payment going forward." "Oh, I'm sorry, I just assumed Mr. and Mrs. Morrison told me that you were handling the financial arrangements because you wanted to contribute to Emma's musical education." Because I wanted to. As if paying for lessons I couldn't afford had been my idea, my generous gift rather than my manipulated obligation. "That arrangement is ending. Please contact them directly." After I hung up, Sarah was staring at me with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. Mom, you can't just stop. Everything will fall apart. Then maybe it was never as stable as we pretended it was. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. Not the accommodating grandmother, not the reliable, unpaid help, not the woman who said yes to everything because she was afraid of becoming irrelevant. Just Margaret Chen, a woman who had finally remembered that her own life mattered too. After Sarah left, storming out with a promise that, "We'll talk about this later when you're thinking more clearly," my apartment felt different. Not empty, but spacious. Like I'd been holding my breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. I sat on my couch, still feeling the warmth where Sarah had been sitting, and tried to process what had just happened. I'd said no, actually said no, and meant it, and stuck to it even when the emotional manipulation reached its peak intensity. My phone was buzzing constantly now. Text after text, call after call, the family emergency response system activating because their reliable resource had malfunctioned. David. Margaret, let's be reasonable here. The kids are really upset. Sarah. Mom, please call me. I think we both said things we didn't mean. Even Emma again. Grandma, I promise I'll help more if you watch us. I can make my own sandwiches. That last one nearly broke my resolve. Sweet Emma. Trying to negotiate her way back to the familiar arrangement by offering to be more self-sufficient. She was learning early that relationships were transactional, that love came with conditions and obligations. But I turned my phone face down and walked to my kitchen. For the first time in months, I opened my refrigerator without calculating whether I could afford to cook myself a proper meal, or if I needed to save money for whatever emergency request might come from Sarah's household. The refrigerator was nearly empty. A carton of eggs, some wilted lettuce, a jar of peanut butter. The freezer held 2 frozen dinners and a loaf of bread. This was what my life had become. Subsistence eating so I could fund my daughter's prosperity. I thought about the grocery receipts scattered on my table from the night before. Hundreds of dollars spent on organic produce, imported cheese, wine for dinner parties I wasn't invited to attend. Meanwhile, I'd been living on generic canned soup and crackers, telling myself it was temporary, that things would improve once Sarah got that raise, or that promotion, or whatever financial milestone she was always approaching, but never quite reaching. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. For the first time in months, I was going grocery shopping for myself, just myself. The Jewel Osco on Clark Street felt different as I walked through its automatic doors. Usually, I rushed through grocery stores with Sarah's lists, her specific brand requirements, her urgency about getting back to relieve her from whatever responsibility she was eager to escape. Today, I had nowhere to be, and no one to please but myself. I took my time in the produce section, actually examining the fruit instead of grabbing whatever was on someone else's list. I picked up a pear and held it to my nose, remembering suddenly that I used to love pears. When had I stopped buying them? When had I stopped thinking about what I actually enjoyed eating? An elderly man sorting through apples smiled at me. Beautiful day, isn't it? It really is, I replied, and meant it. When was the last time a stranger had made casual conversation with me? Usually, when I was grocery shopping, I was rushed, stressed, checking my phone for additional requests from Sarah, calculating costs in my head to make sure I could cover whatever unexpected expense had arisen. I'd moved through stores like a woman on a mission, invisible and purposeful. Today, I felt visible, present. I bought ingredients for a real meal: salmon, fresh vegetables, a bottle of wine that wasn't expensive but wasn't the cheapest option either. At the checkout, when the total appeared on the screen, I didn't feel the familiar pang of anxiety about money. This was my money, spent on my needs, for my enjoyment. The cashier, a young woman with bright purple hair, smiled as she bagged my groceries. Having people over for dinner? No, I said, surprised by the question. Just cooking for myself. Nice. Self-care dinner. I love that. Self-care dinner. The phrase stayed with me as I drove home. When had cooking for myself become an act of rebellion? When had my own comfort become so foreign that a stranger noticed it as unusual? Back in my apartment, I cooked with attention and pleasure I hadn't felt in years. I seasoned the salmon the way I liked it, not bland and overcautious the way Emma preferred. I sautéed vegetables until they were tender, but still had texture, not mushy the way Jake required. I opened the wine and poured myself a glass before the food was even ready, just because I wanted to. As the salmon cooked, filling my small apartment with the smell of lemon and herbs, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. "Hello, Mrs. Chen. This is Rebecca Martinez from Sunshine Daycare Center. We had the Morrison family on our waiting list, and a spot just opened up for this weekend. Mrs. Morrison mentioned you might not be available for childcare, so they asked me to call about emergency placement." Emergency placement. At a daycare center that probably charged more per day than I spent on groceries in a week. Sarah had already moved on to Plan B, finding a replacement for my services, while simultaneously trying to guilt me back into compliance. "I think you'll need to speak with the Morrisons directly about their childcare needs," I said. "Of course. I just wanted to confirm the arrangement since they mentioned you've been their primary caregiver, and this would be a significant change for the children." Primary caregiver. Not grandmother, not family member. Primary caregiver, a professional designation for what I'd been providing for free. After I hung up, I sat down to my self-care dinner. The salmon was perfectly cooked. The vegetables were seasoned exactly to my taste, and the wine was better than I'd expected. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood. Sirens in the distance, the couple upstairs having a muffled argument, Mrs. Rodriguez's terrier barking at something. For the first time in months, these sounds didn't feel lonely. They felt like life happening around me. Life I was part of, rather than separate from. My phone buzzed with another text. "Sarah. Mom, I found a sitter for this weekend, but I want you to know this is hurting the kids. Emma cried when I told her you weren't coming." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar tug of guilt. Emma crying. Sweet, distant Emma, who barely acknowledged my presence but was apparently devastated by my absence. The manipulation was so obvious now that I almost admired its efficiency. But then I thought about Emma's violin teacher assuming I was the one paying for lessons. I thought about David not knowing I'd worked for 45 years, not knowing where I lived, not knowing anything about my life beyond my utility to his family. I typed back, "I hope you told Emma that we can spend time together soon when it's just about us enjoying each other's company, not about childcare duties." Sarah's response was immediate. "That's not how kids think, Mom. They just know their grandmother doesn't want to see them anymore. Their grandmother doesn't want to see them." The inversion was breathtaking. I was the one rejecting my grandchildren, not the one who'd been relegated to unpaid domestic labor in their lives. I didn't respond. Instead, I finished my dinner, washed my single plate and glass, and realized something remarkable. It was only 7:30 on a Friday evening, and I had nothing I had to do. No children to entertain, no groceries to buy for someone else, no phone calls to expect about weekend emergencies or schedule changes. The freedom was almost disorienting. I poured another glass of wine and settled onto my couch with a book I'd bought months ago but never had time to read. The apartment felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in years. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. Around 9 o'clock, my landline rang. I'd forgotten I even had it connected. The caller ID showed my own last name, Chen. Eleanor. My heart stopped. Eleanor Chen was my sister-in-law, my late husband's brother's wife. We'd lost touch years ago, not through any conflict, but through the gradual drift that happens when the person who connected you is gone. "Margaret, it's Eleanor. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Eleanor?" "No, not at all. How did you get this number?" "I've had it for years. Tom gave it to me before he passed. Said if I ever needed to reach you." "I'm sorry I haven't called before now." Eleanor's voice was warm, familiar in a way that made my throat tight. She'd been at my wedding, had held Sarah as a baby, had sent Christmas cards for years after her husband died. "I was just thinking about you today," she continued. "Don't know why, but I had this strong feeling I should call. Are you doing all right, honey?" The endearment, spoken with genuine affection, nearly undid me. When was the last time someone had called me honey and meant it as an expression of care rather than manipulation? I'm actually having a complicated day," I admitted. Want to talk about it? I've got time. And suddenly, I did want to talk about it. I wanted to tell someone who remembered me as more than a childcare provider, someone who'd known me when I was a young mother myself, struggling but hopeful, building a life with dreams and plans that extended beyond serving other people's needs. Eleanor, can I ask you something? Do you remember me being different before? A pause. Different how? More myself, I guess. Like I had opinions and interests and a personality beyond just being helpful. She laughed softly. Margaret, you were one of the strongest women I knew. You raised Sarah alone after Tom died, worked full-time, still found time to volunteer at her school. You had such clear ideas about everything: politics, books, how to raise kids. You were never afraid to speak your mind. I closed my eyes, trying to remember that woman, strong, opinionated, unafraid. I think I lost her somewhere. I whispered. Honey, she's not lost. She's just been quiet for a while. But I can hear her in your voice right now. We talked for over an hour. About her life in Milwaukee, about the book club she'd joined, about her volunteer work at the animal shelter. She asked about my retirement, my health, my interests. Questions no one had asked me in years. When we finally hung up, with promises to call each other more often, I realized I felt more like myself than I had in months. Eleanor had reminded me that I was a person with a history, with capabilities, with value that existed independently of what I could provide for others. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in years. No phone beside my bed in case of emergency calls. No mental list of tasks I needed to complete for other people. No anxiety about whether I'd done enough to maintain my tenuous place in my own family's life. I slept the sleep of a woman who had finally remembered that her own rest mattered too. The next morning, Saturday, I woke naturally. Not to an alarm, not to a phone call, but to sunlight streaming through my windows and the pleasant realization that the day belonged entirely to me. For the first time in 3 years, I had a weekend with no obligations to anyone but myself. It felt like freedom. It felt like coming back to life. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual peace. I'd spent Saturday reading, taking a long bath, and having another conversation with Eleanor. She'd invited me to visit Milwaukee the following weekend, just to spend time together, no agenda, no obligations. The invitation felt like a gift I'd forgotten existed. I was making myself pancakes, real pancakes, not the frozen kind I'd been eating to save money, when someone knocked on my door. Not the doorbell, but heavy, insistent knocking that made my small apartment feel like it was under siege. Through the peephole, I saw Sarah, David, and both children standing in the hallway. Emma was holding a piece of paper, and Jake was clutching a small wrapped box. They looked like a delegation arriving for formal negotiations. I opened the door. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice artificially bright. "We came to apologize. The kids wanted to give you something." Emma stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Grandma Margaret, I made you this card." She handed me a piece of construction paper folded in half. On the front, she'd drawn a stick figure with gray hair labeled Grandma, and a smaller figure labeled Me. Inside, in her careful 12-year-old handwriting, "I'm sorry you're sad. I love you. Please don't be mad at Mom." My heart clenched. This sweet child had been coached to take responsibility for the adult conflicts she couldn't possibly understand. She'd been told that I was sad, that I was mad at her mother, that somehow her apology could fix whatever was wrong. Jake stepped forward next, holding out his wrapped box. "I made this for you in art class, before Mom said you were upset." Inside was a small clay bowl, painted blue with yellow flowers. Crooked and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. "It's for your keys," Jake said proudly, "so you don't lose them." I knelt down to their level, looking into their faces. Emma's worried, Jake's hopeful. These children loved me, I realized. Not just as a service provider, but as their grandmother. The tragedy was that they'd been taught to express that love through guilt and obligation rather than genuine connection. "Thank you both," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning in my chest. "These are beautiful gifts. I love them, and I love you." "So you'll watch us again?" Jake asked, his 8-year-old logic making the connection he'd been coached to make. "Jake, honey, That's not how love works. Love isn't something you earn by giving gifts or apologizing for things that aren't your fault. Sarah stepped forward, her jaw tight. Mom, can we come in? We need to have a family meeting. A family meeting. The formal terminology made it sound official, important, like a corporate reorganization where my role would be redefined and my cooperation would be required. I stepped aside to let them in, watching as they arranged themselves in my living room like a tribunal. Sarah and David sat on my couch, the children on the floor between us. The positioning was deliberate. The kids as buffers, emotional shields to prevent me from saying anything too harsh. Mom, Sarah began, her voice taking on the measured tone of a professional presentation. We've been thinking about what you said on Friday, about feeling unappreciated. Feeling unappreciated. My systematic exploitation reduced to hurt feelings that could be managed with better communication. We want you to know that we hear you, David added, nodding earnestly. We understand that you need to feel valued. They spoke in turns, like they'd rehearsed this conversation, which they probably had. So we've come up with a solution, Sarah continued. We're going to start paying you for babysitting, $20 an hour plus expenses. That way, you'll know how much we value your time. $20 an hour. I calculated quickly. They used my services roughly 12 hours a week. That would be $240, which was more than I'd been spending on their various requests. But it was also exactly what they'd pay any professional babysitter, nothing more. And, David added, we're going to be better about including you in family activities. We'll invite you to dinner once a month, and the kids can spend one afternoon a week with you. Not for babysitting, just for fun. Once a month, one afternoon a week. My relationship with my own grandchildren was being scheduled like a business meeting. Emma looked up at me hopefully. Doesn't that sound good, Grandma? These children had been dragged into an adult conversation they couldn't understand, coached to deliver emotional ammunition, and now they were waiting for my response like their happiness depended on it. It sounds very organized, I said carefully. Sarah smiled, mistaking my neutral tone for acceptance. We thought you'd like having a clear structure. No more confusion about expectations. Whose expectations? Her smile faltered slightly. Well, everyone's. Yours, ours, the kids. What are my expectations, Sarah? You. You want to spend more time with us. You want to feel appreciated. I want to be treated like a person, not a service provider. I want my daughter to call me because she misses talking to me, not because she needs something. I want my grandchildren to know who I am beyond the woman who watches them when it's convenient. David leaned forward. Margaret, we understand that. That's why we're proposing this new arrangement. You'll be paid for your time, and you'll have guaranteed family time too. Guaranteed family time. I repeated the phrase slowly. David, do you schedule guaranteed time with your own mother? That's different. How? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Sarah jumped in quickly. Mom, David's mother lives in Florida. The situations aren't comparable. You're right. They're not. David's mother chose to move to Florida. I live 20 minutes away and I've been treated like a stranger for 3 years. Jake was looking between the adults with the wide-eyed confusion of a child who'd walked into a conversation he wasn't equipped to understand. Emma was studying her hands, her shoulders tense with the weight of adult conflicts being played out around her. Kids, I said gently, would you like to go look at my neighbor's garden? Mrs. Rodriguez has new flowers, and I think she'd love to show them to you. Sarah started to object, but I was already walking Emma and Jake to the door. Mrs. Rodriguez was indeed outside, tending to her small balcony garden, and she was delighted to have young visitors. When I returned to my apartment, Sarah and David were sitting in tense silence. Mom, you can't just dismiss the kids when we're trying to have a family discussion, Sarah said. I can when the discussion is about how adults are going to use those kids as emotional weapons. And that's not what we're doing, isn't it? You brought them here to make it harder for me to say no. You had Emma make me a card apologizing for your behavior. You had Jake give me a gift and then ask if I'd watch them again, as if love is a transaction. Sarah's composure cracked. Mom, I don't know what you want from me. I'm trying to fix this. I'm offering to pay you, to spend more time with you. What more can I do? You can stop trying to manage me and start trying to know me. I do know you. You're my mother. When was the last time you asked me about my day? My health? My thoughts on anything that doesn't directly relate to your needs? We talk all the time. We communicate about logistics. You tell me what you need, I provide it. That's not the same as talking. David cleared his throat. Margaret, I think you're being a little harsh. Sarah works hard. She's under a lot of pressure. Sometimes the day-to-day stuff takes priority. David, let me ask you something. What's my middle name? He blinked. Your middle name? What's my favorite color? What kind of books do I like to read? What did I do for work before I retired? What are my hobbies? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I'm not good with details, he said finally. Those aren't details. Those are the basic facts of a person's life. You've known me for 12 years, and you can't answer a single question about who I am as an individual. Sarah stood up abruptly. Mom, this is ridiculous. We're here trying to work things out, and you're giving us some kind of test. It's not a test, Sarah. It's a revelation. You're upset because your childcare provider is malfunctioning, not because you've damaged your relationship with your mother. That's not true. Then prove it. Tell me something about my life that doesn't relate to what I can do for you. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Finally, she said, You like to cook. Because you've seen me cook for your family. What else? You're good with kids. Because I've taken care of yours. What else? You worked retail for 45 years. What kind of retail? What did I enjoy about it? What was difficult? What did I hope to do after retirement? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I don't know, she whispered. I know. You don't know because you've never asked. In 3 years of regular contact, you've never once asked me about my dreams, my fears, my hopes, my memories. You've never asked what I do with my time when I'm not serving your needs. David stood up, his discomfort evident. Margaret, I think we should all take a step back here. This is getting too emotional. Too emotional? David, we're talking about a mother-daughter relationship. It's supposed to be emotional, but not like this, not confrontational. What you call confrontational, I call honest. For the first time in 3 years, I'm telling you how I really feel instead of just accommodating your needs. Sarah was crying now, real tears that weren't calculated or strategic. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you feel used, invisible, like a convenient appliance. Yes, I'm sorry. The apology hung between us, genuine but insufficient. Sorry didn't undo 3 years of systematic exploitation. Sorry didn't restore the relationship we'd lost or create the connection we'd never built. Sarah, I know you're sorry, but sorry doesn't change the fundamental problem. You see me as a resource to be managed, not as a person to be known. That's not true. I love you. I believe you do. But you love me the way you'd love a very reliable service provider. You love what I do for you, not who I am. She collapsed back onto the couch, her perfectly controlled facade finally crumbling completely. I don't know how to fix this. You start by getting to know me, as a person, not as your mother, not as the kid's grandmother, but as Margaret Chen, an individual with her own life and thoughts and interests. How do I do that? You ask questions. You listen to the answers. You spend time with me when you don't need anything from me. David looked at his watch. Margaret, we should probably get going. The kids have soccer practice. Always somewhere else to be. Always another obligation more important than the conversation we were having. Go, I said. But understand that things have changed. I'm not available for childcare anymore. I'm not available for emergency grocery runs or last-minute favors. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be because you want to know me, not because you need something from me. Sarah stood up, wiping her eyes. What about the kids? They need their grandmother. They need a grandmother who has a real relationship with them, not a woman who's been reduced to childcare duties. So you're just cutting us off? I'm setting boundaries. I'm requiring respect. I'm insisting that if you want me in your life, it has to be because you value me as a person. As they gathered their things, preparing to leave, Emma peeked around the door. Grandma Margaret? Are you still mad? I knelt down and took her hands. Sweetheart, I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad at anyone. I'm just teaching the adults in your life how to treat me better. Can we still be friends? We can be more than friends. We can be a real grandmother and granddaughter. But that means spending time together just because we enjoy each other's company, not because your parents need someone to watch you. She nodded solemnly, like she understood more than the adults had given her credit for. After they left, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of the confrontation. Emma's card, Jake's clay bowl, the faint scent of Sarah's perfume lingering in the air. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had told the complete truth about my life. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I had no idea if Sarah would accept my boundaries or if she would disappear entirely rather than do the work of building a real relationship. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done being invisible in my own life. 3 weeks passed in silence. No calls, no texts, no emergency requests. The absence of chaos felt like stepping out of a windstorm into perfect stillness. At first, I waited for the familiar anxiety to creep in. The fear that I'd pushed too hard, demanded too much, lost them forever. But as the days passed, what I felt instead was relief. Relief, and something I hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity about my own life. On a Tuesday morning, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I called in sick to my own routine. Instead of the grocery store run I'd planned, instead of cleaning my apartment, instead of the careful budget calculations that usually consumed my mornings, I drove to the Chicago Botanic Garden. I hadn't been there since Sarah was a child, back when we'd packed peanut butter sandwiches and spent afternoons wandering the paths. Her small hand in mine as she asked endless questions about flowers and trees. The memory felt like something from another lifetime, from when I was a different person entirely. The garden was magnificent in early fall. The air was crisp but not cold, filled with the smell of decomposing leaves and the last blooms of the season. I walked slowly, with no agenda, no schedule to keep, no phone calls to anticipate. For the first time in years, time belonged entirely to me. I found myself in the rose garden, surrounded by late-season blooms that were past their peak, but still beautiful in their imperfection. An elderly man sitting on a nearby bench nodded at me. "Beautiful day for a walk," he said. "It really is," I replied, and meant it completely. "I'm here every Tuesday," he continued. "Name's Frank. You look familiar. Do you come here often?" "Not often enough," I said, surprising myself with the honesty. "I'm Margaret." Frank patted the bench beside him. "Care to sit? I was just thinking about how much this place has changed over the years." I sat down, and we talked for over an hour. About the garden, about Chicago, about the way the city had evolved over the decades we'd both called it home. Frank was a retired teacher, widowed 3 years ago, who'd discovered that retirement could be lonely unless you made an effort to connect with the world around you. "The hardest part," he said, "was learning that my life still mattered, even when no one needed me to be anything specific anymore." His words hit me with unexpected force. That was exactly what I'd been learning, that my life had value beyond its utility to others. "I spent 40 years in the classroom," Frank continued. "When I retired, I thought I'd just fade away, you know? But then I realized I had a choice. I could disappear, or I could figure out who I was when I wasn't Teacher Frank." "Who did you discover you were?" He smiled. "Gardener Frank, Reader Frank, guy who talks to strangers in parks Frank." Turns out there were a lot of versions of me I'd never met. When I left the garden that afternoon, I had Frank's phone number and an invitation to join his Tuesday walks. More importantly, I had a glimpse of what life could look like when it was mine to design. That evening, Eleanor called. "Margaret, I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up?" I told her about my afternoon at the garden, about Frank, about the strange peace I was finding in my new solitude. "That doesn't sound strange at all," Eleanor said. "It sounds like you're remembering who you are. I've been thinking about what you said last week, about me being different before. I'm trying to remember what I used to enjoy, what I used to dream about. What are you discovering?" I looked around my apartment, seeing it with new eyes. I used to love to read. I mean, really love it. I'd stay up until 3 in the morning with a book. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself I didn't have time for frivolous things like reading for pleasure. What else? I used to cook. Not just functional cooking, but experimental cooking. I'd try new recipes, invite neighbors over, make it an event. When did I stop doing that? When did you start believing that your own pleasure didn't matter? The question hung in the air. When had I made the decision that my interests were less important than other people's needs? When had I started rationing my own joy? Eleanor, can I ask you something? Of course. What do you do with your time? I mean, how do you structure your days when no one else is depending on you? She laughed. Honey, I do whatever I want. I wake up when I feel like it. I read mystery novels. I volunteer at the animal shelter. I take painting classes. I have lunch with friends. I go to movies in the middle of the afternoon. I live my life like it belongs to me. Doesn't it get lonely? Sometimes. But lonely is different from being used. Lonely is an emotion. Being used is a condition. I'd rather be occasionally lonely than constantly diminished. After we hung up, I sat with her words. I'd rather be occasionally lonely than constantly diminished. Was that what I'd been? Diminished? I thought about the woman who'd raised Sarah alone, who'd worked 2 jobs and still found energy to attend school plays and soccer games. That woman had opinions about everything. Politics, books, parenting, life. She'd been fierce and independent and proud of what she'd built. Where had she gone? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I signed up for something just for myself. The Chicago Public Library was offering a book club focused on contemporary fiction. The next meeting was Thursday evening, discussing a novel I'd never heard of, but found intriguing when I read the description. I bought the book and read it in 2 days, making notes in the margins like I used to do in college. When was the last time I'd had thoughts about literature that weren't related to whether Emma might enjoy a particular story? Thursday evening, I walked into the Lincoln Park Library feeling nervous but excited. The book club met in a small conference room, and there were 8 other people, mostly women, mostly around my age, but a few younger faces too. The discussion leader, a librarian named Janet, welcomed me warmly. First time? Wonderful. We're always happy to have new perspectives. For the next 2 hours, I talked about books and ideas and characters with people who didn't know me as anyone's mother or grandmother. They knew me only as Margaret, a woman who'd read the same book they had and had thoughts about it. My thoughts, my opinions, my perspective. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed having my own mind matter to someone. After the meeting, a woman named Patricia approached me. She was about my age, with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. You mentioned you used to work in retail, she said. I'm starting a small business, handmade jewelry, and I could use some advice about customer service and display. Would you be interested in coffee sometime? I'd love to pick your brain. Someone wanted to pick my brain. Someone valued my decades of experience and wanted to learn from it. When was the last time anyone had asked for my professional opinion? I'd love that, I said. We made plans for the following week, and I walked home feeling lighter than I had in years. I had a book club, a potential consulting opportunity, Tuesday walks with Frank, and weekend plans to visit Eleanor in Milwaukee. I had a life that was mine. When I got home, there was a voicemail on my landline. Sarah's voice, uncertain and small. Mom, it's me. I've been thinking about what you said, about not knowing who you are. I'd like to learn. If you're willing to teach me, could we maybe have coffee sometime? Just to talk? Not about the kids or David or anything I need. Just to talk? I listened to the message 3 times before deciding how to respond. I called her back the next morning. Sarah, it's Mom. I got your message. Mom. Her voice was thick with emotion. Thank you for calling back. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, I said honestly. But I decided to give you a chance to prove you mean what you said. I do mean it. I've been thinking about those questions you asked, about not knowing your favorite color or what books you like. It made me realize I don't really know you at all. No, you don't. The bluntness might have hurt her, but I was done softening truths to protect other people's feelings. Will you help me change that? I thought about it for a moment. Sarah, I'm not the same person I was a month ago. I'm not going to go back to being available for whatever you need whenever you need it. I'm building a life that matters to me. I understand. Do you? Because I have book club on Thursday evenings. I have walks with a friend on Tuesdays. I'm consulting with a woman who's starting a business. I'm visiting Eleanor in Milwaukee next weekend. My life is full now, full of things that matter to me. A pause. That's wonderful, Mom. You sound happier. I am happier. Could I be part of that life? Not as someone who needs things from you, but as someone who wants to know you. The question was tentative, vulnerable in a way Sarah hadn't been with me in years. We can try, I said, but it has to be real, Sarah. It has to be about genuine interest in who I am, not about managing me back into compliance. I want to try. Really try. Then let's start with coffee, just conversation. No agenda, no children, no favors to ask or problems to solve. Just two women getting to know each other. I'd like that. We made plans for the following Sunday. And after I hung up, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't desperate for her approval anymore. I wasn't terrified of losing her. I had other people who valued me, other activities that fulfilled me, other sources of purpose and connection. If Sarah wanted to rebuild our relationship, she'd have to do it on equal terms. I was no longer willing to be the only one investing in our connection. That evening, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw something I hadn't seen in years. A woman who looked forward to tomorrow, not because of what she could do for others, but because of what she might discover about herself. I was 73 years old, and I was finally learning who I was when I wasn't trying to be everything to everyone else. It felt like being born again. 6 months later, I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop on Lincoln Avenue, waiting for Sarah to arrive for our weekly coffee date. Yes, weekly. It had taken time. Months of careful, sometimes awkward conversations. But we'd built something neither of us had expected. An actual relationship. The woman who walked through the door was different from the Sarah who'd stormed out of my apartment that Sunday in October. She moved with less urgency, looked around the room with genuine interest rather than impatience. When she spotted me, her smile was real, not calculated for effect. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I stopped to look at that mural on the corner. When did they paint that?" "Last month," I said. "The artist is from the neighborhood. She based it on photographs from residents. There's Mrs. Rodriguez's old terrier in the bottom corner." Sarah looked genuinely delighted. I would have walked right past it 6 months ago. She was right. 6 months ago, Sarah had moved through the world like a woman perpetually late for something more important than whatever was happening in the present moment. Now she noticed murals, asked about the artists, took time to appreciate the small beauties that filled ordinary days. "How was your week?" I asked, settling back with my coffee. A real latte now, not the basic black coffee I used to order to save money. "Good, actually. Really good. Emma had her violin recital on Tuesday. A few months ago, that sentence would have been followed by a request for me to attend, or to help with transportation, or to contribute to the reception afterward. Now it was just information, shared the way people share the details of their lives with those they care about. How did she do? Beautifully. She played that piece by Bach we heard at the symphony last month. You know, the one you said reminded you of water running over stones? I remembered that evening. Sarah had invited me to the Chicago Symphony, not because she needed a babysitter or a favor, but because she thought I might enjoy it. During intermission, we'd talked about the music, about how different pieces evoked different images. It was the kind of conversation we'd never had before. The kind that revealed how we each experienced the world. "I'd love to hear her play it sometime," I said. "Actually, I was hoping you'd come to dinner on Sunday. Emma wants to perform it for you, and Jake has been practicing a magic trick he learned at school. David's making his famous lasagna." The invitation was warm, genuine, free of the desperate undertones that used to characterize our interactions. If I said no, Sarah wouldn't panic or start negotiating. She'd be disappointed, but she'd understand. That knowledge made saying yes feel like a choice rather than an obligation. "I'd love to," I said. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself." "Well, maybe one of those apple tarts you made for book club. Jake keeps asking about them." I laughed. My apple tarts had become somewhat famous in my expanding social circle. Frank had raved about them after I'd brought one to our Tuesday walk group. Patricia had requested the recipe for a small catering event she was planning. The book club had declared them better than anything from the fancy bakeries downtown. I'd forgotten I knew how to make them. I'd forgotten a lot of things about myself that had come flooding back once I'd given myself permission to matter. "How's the jewelry business going?" I asked Patricia, who had become not just a client, but a genuine friend. "Better than I ever imagined. That advice you gave me about display techniques doubled my sales at the last craft fair. I keep telling people I have the best retail consultant in Chicago working with me." Sarah smiled. "It's amazing how much expertise you developed over all those years. I never really thought about it before." She never really thought about it before. The old Sarah would have been embarrassed by this admission, would have covered it with excuses or deflection. This Sarah acknowledged it simply as a fact that represented her previous limitations rather than my inadequacy. "What about you?" I asked. "How are things at work?" Her face lit up in a way that used to be reserved for discussions about her children or her achievements. Now she was genuinely excited to share her professional life with me, not because she was bragging or seeking approval, but because she'd learned that I was actually interested in her work. "We landed that account I mentioned last month, the sustainable packaging company. I'll be leading their entire rebranding campaign." "Sarah, that's wonderful. You've been wanting to work on more environmentally focused projects." "You remembered." Of course I remembered. And I had, because now when Sarah talked, I listened not for what she might need from me, but for who she was becoming, what excited her, what challenged her. I'd discovered that my daughter was intelligent, creative, ambitious in ways that had nothing to do with managing her household or controlling her resources. I'd also discovered that she was working hard to become a better person. "Mom, can I tell you something?" "Always." "I've been thinking about the way I was before, the way I treated you, and I realize I learned it somewhere." I waited, not sure where this was going. "I learned it from watching Dad treat you." The statement hung between us like a revelation. Sarah rarely talked about her father, about the years before he left us. But she was right. Mark had treated me like a resource to be managed, appreciated only when I was useful, ignored when I wasn't immediately necessary. I watched him come home from work and barely acknowledge you unless he needed something. I watched him make decisions about money and vacations, and even furniture without consulting you. I watched him take credit for things you'd done and dismiss your opinions about things that mattered. My throat tightened. I'd never realized she'd noticed, had never considered that my acceptance of dismissive treatment might have taught her that this was how relationships worked. "I'm not making excuses," she continued quickly. "I'm an adult. I should have known better. But I think I unconsciously absorbed the idea that mothers just give, that it was normal for the woman in the family to sacrifice everything for everyone else." "Sarah, let me finish. I want you to know that I see it now. I see how wrong it was, how wrong I was. And I want you to know that Emma won't learn that from me. She's already asking more questions about your life, about what you like and what makes you happy. She wants to know you as a person, not just as grandma." I felt tears prick my eyes. "That means everything to me. You've taught us all something important by standing up for yourself. You've taught Emma that women don't have to disappear to be good family members. You've taught Jake that love isn't something you take, it's something you share. And you've taught me that relationships should make people bigger, not smaller." The coffee shop bustled around us, full of people having their own conversations, living their own lives. But in our small corner, something profound was being acknowledged and healed. "There's something else I want to tell you," Sarah said. "David and I have been talking, and we want to contribute to your savings account. Not as repayment. We both know we could never repay everything you gave us, but as recognition that you should be building wealth for your own future, not just supporting ours." I started to protest, but she held up her hand. "This isn't about guilt or obligation. It's about family taking care of family, the way it should have been all along. 6 months ago, this conversation would have been impossible. Sarah wouldn't have had the self-awareness to recognize the patterns she'd inherited and perpetuated. I wouldn't have had the self-respect to receive her apology without immediately minimizing it or rushing to make her feel better. Now we could sit with difficult truths, acknowledge past mistakes, and choose to build something better going forward. I have something to tell you too, I said. I'm thinking about taking a trip. A real trip, not just visiting Eleanor. Where? Ireland. I've always wanted to see the countryside there, and there's a literary tour that follows the paths of Irish writers. Patricia mentioned it. She went last year. Sarah's face broke into a genuine smile. Mom, that sounds incredible. When? Maybe next spring. I want to plan it properly, do some research, maybe learn a little about Irish history before I go. Will you send me postcards? Real old-fashioned postcards with terrible tourist jokes on them? Absolutely. We finished our coffee, and as we prepared to leave, Sarah hugged me. Not the quick, obligatory embrace of someone checking a box, but the real hug of someone who genuinely enjoyed spending time with me. Same time next week? She asked. I'll be here. As I walked home through the streets of Chicago, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman disappearing from her own life, funding her own marginalization, accepting crumbs of affection in exchange for substantial sacrifice. Today, I was Margaret Chen, reader, consultant, friend, grandmother, and woman with plans to see Ireland. I had a book club, a walking group, a growing business relationship, and a coffee date with my daughter that I looked forward to rather than dreaded. I had a life that belonged to me. The apartment I returned to was the same size as before, but it felt larger somehow. The walls were covered with new additions, photos from book club events, a painting Patricia had made for me, postcards from Eleanor's travels, a thank you note from Frank after I'd helped him plan his grandson's birthday party, evidence of connections built on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. That evening, as I prepared dinner for myself, salmon again, because I liked salmon and I could afford salmon and no one else's preferences needed to be considered, I thought about all the women who might be listening to this story. Women who recognize themselves in the pattern of endless giving without receiving. Women who've been trained to believe that love requires them to disappear, that being good means accepting less than they deserve, that family obligations should always supersede personal needs. I wanted them to know what I'd learned. That setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. That demanding respect isn't cruel, it's healthy. That choosing yourself isn't abandonment, it's survival. Most importantly, I wanted them to understand that it's never too late to remember who you are when you're not trying to be everything to everyone else. I was 73 years old when I finally learned that my life mattered as much as anyone else's, that my dreams deserved attention, my interests deserved time, my needs deserved consideration. Some people might think 73 is too late for new beginnings, but I've learned that every day you're alive is another chance to choose yourself, to demand better, to build the life you deserve rather than the life others find convenient. As I settled down with my book, a mystery novel Eleanor had recommended, I smiled at how different this evening felt from those lonely, anxious nights 6 months ago. I was still alone, but I was no longer lonely. I was still 73, but I was no longer old. I was still a mother and grandmother, but I was no longer only a mother and grandmother. I was Margaret Chen, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing from your own life, giving so much that there was nothing left for yourself? Have you ever wondered if the people you love see you as a person, or just as what you can provide for them? If this story sounds familiar, I want you to know that you're not alone, and it's not too late to change things. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself? I'd love to hear your story. And if this message resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Maybe this story will reach someone who needs to hear that their life matters too, that they deserve relationships built on respect rather than obligation, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Thank you for listening, and remember, you matter. Your dreams matter. Your happiness matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.